All right, you just heard the defense closing arguments in the Jason Van Dyke case. Again, Jason Van Dyke, Chicago police officer on trial for murder, shooting Laquan McDonald, who was 17 at the time. He shot him 16 times. I want to bring on my guest, Matt Mangino, criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor. Matt, how are you today, sir?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure to have you on. So listen, look, I have the best of both worlds with you, and I think we have an interesting dynamic here. I'm former law enforcement. You're former prosecutor, now defense attorney. How do you think the defense did in that closing? Because he brought up some very interesting points, right? He talked about the gun range where Van Dyke would train, and it was nothing for him to empty his gun. He talked about the use of force continuum, the use of force policies, and when officers can use deadly force. So what are your thoughts on his closings?
Well, his closing was very methodical. I mean, he went through each point that he thought he needed to convince the jury here that there was a reasonable doubt about this charge of murder in the first degree. So, I think he did what he had to do in terms of laying it out for the jury so that they could understand exactly what the circumstances were. The prosecution's closing was very quick. The defense's was a much more in-depth, more detail with regard to testimony that's been presented during the course of the trial. I think the defense has to do that. I think the prosecution has a strong case. I think the defense really has to work hard to convince this jury that there's a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the prosecution, right, we've all seen this dash cam, several times throughout this trial. And I think that's the biggest thing for the defense, in my opinion, to overcome here. I listened to Van Dyke's testimony when he took the stand yesterday, and there was a lot of stuff he said, like Laquan was advancing towards him. He had the knife up towards his left shoulder as he approached. He looked him directly in the eye. But as you're watching this video, and me, even as a former law enforcement, I just don't see where that happened here. And I don't know if the jury is going to be swayed by that testimony of Van Dyke, but to say that's exactly what he was thinking in that exact moment. What say you?
Well, Jason Van Dyke's testimony was not consistent with the videotape that we have all watched and that people all across the country have watched for quite a while now. Even the reenactment that was presented on his behalf, on behalf of the defense, wasn't consistent with what Jason Van Dyke testified to. And here you also have a situation where a police officer discharged 16 rounds into a suspect, someone that he feared might escape at that point. That doesn't follow, police use of force protocol anywhere that I've ever seen or had an opportunity to review. Usually it's, 2 shots to the center mass, and you want to, disable the assailant. Here you have 16 rounds, and the defense's explanation for those 16 rounds into the suspect here, I don't think really, carries water.
Yeah, well, Matt, I will say, again, as former law enforcement, what we're taught during the academy and through in-service is you shoot until you believe the threat is eliminated, right? So maybe that's why the defense was talking about this use of force policy and the policies as it relates to shooting someone that could be a threat to other people in the public. And I think that's what Van Dyke was trying to relay during his testimony yesterday. We're actually going to take a quick break. Things are heating up in the windy city of Chicago. Jason Van Dyke on trial right now for the murder of Laquan McDonald. He shot him 16 times when he was 17 years old. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Okay, that was part of the prosecution's closing argument in the Jason Van Dyke case. Matt, I want to talk to you about some of the things she said here. Van Dyke, according to one of the other officers, said, "I guess we'll have to shoot him." And it hinges on these 3 words, in my opinion: when it's reasonable, right? Again, I've been in these high-stress situations in my years in law enforcement. The problem I'm having here, as you can see Van Dyke on the stand, there were several officers that had been at the scene much longer than Van Dyke was there. None of those officers used deadly force. Van Dyke shows up. A few seconds later, he shoots Laquan McDonald 16 times, as you can see that video rolling there on the screen. I think the defense is going to have a hard time overcoming this. Matt, what do you think?
Well, yes, they're trying to suggest to the jury that there was justification for Jason McDonald's conduct. And as we've heard, his conduct has to be reasonable and necessary, according to what an ordinary, prudent police officer would do. And what we have here are multiple police officers faced with the same exact circumstances who decided not to use deadly force. And I think that's important in this case. Now, if there were multiple police officers who decided simultaneously to open fire on Mr. McDonald, then that might be a different story. But here we know there are multiple police officers, all who were going to measure by this reasonable, prudent police officer standard, and only one chose to discharge his firearm and use deadly force under these circumstances. That is a huge hurdle for the defense to get over in this case.
Right, absolutely. And not only that, I mean, listening to Van Dyke himself, he said Laquan was advancing at him. I think that's a huge hurdle as well. I don't think he'll be able to actually prove that Laquan was advancing at him based on that dash cam video. Although the defense came out with their own animated video, I don't think we'll get there. We're actually going to take a quick break here on the Law&Crime Network. Stay tuned. Again, it's going down in the Windy City. Jason Van Dyke on trial for the murder of Laquan McDonald. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. The prosecution is still giving their rebuttal in the closing arguments. Jason Van Dyke still with me, Matt Mangino. Matt, I want to bring something up here. I know during one of the statements the prosecution made, they told the jury, hey, don't concern yourself with motive, malice, or premeditation. But I'm listening to this statement that Van Dyke allegedly made. Why hasn't someone shot him yet? And then we heard testimony that Van Dyke says we're going to have to shoot him. So in that moment, would that not be premeditation?
It certainly sounds like it to me, and I was curious about that argument that was being made. I mean, the prosecution is specifically saying that Jason Van Dyke went there with the intent to shoot Laquan McDonald.
Right.
And that's certainly premeditation. I mean, as you know, premeditation can be established in a matter of seconds.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is an act of going to a specific location with the intent to shoot somebody. And that's exactly what the prosecution's arguing here.
Right. Absolutely. As you can see, there's movement in court. Let's get back to court right now. All right. You just saw it. The prosecution had their rebuttal in the Jason Van Dyke case. Matt, I want to talk about some of the things he said here. And I got to go back to this whole why hasn't someone shot him yet? You can see the defendant there on the stand or seated at his table getting some water there. Why hasn't someone shot him? I've been in these calls. I've never asked a fellow officer, why hasn't someone shot someone or put them down? What do you make of that, and how important do you think that will play on the jury?
Well, I think it goes to his state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he arrived at the scene with the idea that Laquan McDonald should be shot. I mean, he's confused why he hasn't already been shot. And then moments later, he shoots him 16 times. There are at least 11 other officers or 10 other officers present who have assessed the situation, who hadn't made the same decision that Jason Van Dyke did. So, his state of mind is important, especially with regard to the issue of first-degree murder, premeditated murder.
Right.
Was this a reaction to an assessment by a professional police officer who at that point felt that he was justified as a police officer in protecting himself, the other officers, and the public to take action, to take deadly force? Or was this someone who went there with the idea that he needs to use deadly force? Was that decision already made? Had it already been made, may be very troubling for the defense in this case.
Yeah, and one of the things I find striking as far as the defense argument, if we can get the producers to put the dash cam video back up, during their statements, they were saying that most of those shots, if not all, to Laquan came when he was standing up. But the more, I've watched this video hundreds of times, as we all have across this country, when you watch this, it's just hard to say that those shots, 16, occurred while he was still standing. And you could actually see Van Dyke taking a step towards Laquan, even though his testimony says that Laquan was advancing towards him. So his testimony doesn't match that dash cam footage. And I think for the jury, that's what it will come down to. We're going to take a quick break, have more from Chicago, Jason Van Dyke murder trial. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network.